I'm Fedra Monachou, and I'm happy to present our paper on standardized tests and affirmative action, the role of bias and variance. This is joint work with Nikhil Garg and Hannah Lee. The University of California recently suspended the requirement that applicants from California submit SAT scores, with plans to ultimately design its own test. Many other colleges followed, and the trend of waiving the test score requirement in admissions has accelerated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The use of standardized test scores in admissions is an open debate. A common question is whether dropping test scores will help expand access and equity, or instead lead to the admission of less prepared students. So far, test scores have played an important role in admissions decisions. Proponents of test scores claim that standardized tests offer a systematic means of collecting information about applicants and express concerns that the bias in other application features, such as the bias we see in recommendation letters, might be greater. The most important concern, though, is that dropping test scores will lead to a ban-the-box or statistical discrimination type of effect. This effect can arise due to bias in terms of differences in the mean, but it can also arise due to differences in feature precision, as we will see in this paper. The concern is actually that in the absence of standardized testing, a capable student from a little-known school may be more challenging to evaluate, further benefiting students from privileged and historically familiar to the school backgrounds. On the other hand, dropping test scores might help expand access and equity. Test scores exhibit racial gaps and might reinforce existing inequalities in higher education. There are also several barriers to testing for certain groups of students in terms of both test preparation or access to the test itself. Here are some statistics highlighting this disparate access to testing. For example, 8% of lower-income students compared to 78% of high-income students use a test preparation service. Also, we know that for every 10 poor students who score college-ready on the ACT or SAT, there are 5 other poor students who would score college-ready but who take neither exam. Motivated by these competing claims about the role of test scores, in this paper we study the trade-off between test informativeness and disparate access. Specifically, we provide the theoretical framework to study the effect of testing requirement on academic merit and diversity in college admissions at a single Bayesian optimal school. Our paper's main takeaways are 2. First, dropping test scores has an ambiguous impact on disparities depending on the features variances in both groups and access barriers to testing. Second, given substantial barriers to testing, dropping test scores improves both academic merit and diversity by increasing the applicant pool size. In the paper, we provide theoretical results, simulations, and a data application using data from the Texas Higher Education Opportunity Project. Our paper contributes to a long line of literature in economics and machine learning that looks on discrimination in markets, school choice, college admissions, affirmative action, and several notions of algorithmic fairness. Our model is actually an extension of Phelps' seminal Gaussian framework to multiple features with non-identical distributions. Okay, so now that the motivation is clear, the rest of the talk will focus on the model, the theoretical results, and a brief overview of a data application. So let's jump right into the model. We consider a single school with a limited capacity C, which receives applications from a continuum of students of mass normalized to 1. We consider 2 social groups of students, A and B, and as we will see on the next slide, the 2 groups might differ in their size and other characteristics. Each student is characterized by a true skill level Q, which is drawn from a normal distribution with parameters mu and sigma. This distribution is common for both groups A and B, meaning the two groups of students are a priori identical in terms of skill. The school does not observe the true skill Q of an applicant, but instead observes some noisy features theta k, which are the sum of the student's true skill level Q and some Gaussian noise epsilon. The parameters of this noise distribution might, however, differ, first across different features, and second across groups, and the parameters may differ in terms of both mean and variance. So Group B students in our framework face an informational disadvantage due to the unequal precisions across the features. Specifically, we assume that the total precision for Group A, or privileged students as we call them, is higher than the total precisions in the features of Group B, or disadvantaged students. We also consider that students might face some barriers to testing, meaning that only a fraction gamma G of each group G can take the test. Some of our results consider a setting with no barriers at all, but others assume that group A students have greater access to testing than group B students. Next, we define admissions policies in our setting. An admissions policy that the school might adopt has three parts. First, the school decides whether to use all K features or just K minus 1 features. So if the last feature K denotes the test score, then the latter policy means that the test scores are not observed by the school and applicants do not need to take the test. So given the feature set that the school decides to take into account, for example, whether to use test scores or not, we assume that the school, which is Bayesian and group aware, computes the perceived skill estimate Q tilde. So this is the expected value of the true skill level Q given the observed features theta and the knowledge of the student's group membership G. So in other words, this Q tilde, it is the best the school can do given all the available information it has for a student. Although our theory results focus on group-aware policies, in simulations we also study group-unaware policies, meaning policies that do not have access to the group an individual student belongs to. Finally, given those estimates, the school may wish to apply affirmative action or not. And when a school applies affirmative action, we mean that it sets a target fraction tau of students that it wishes to admit. So given an admission policy, we look at three metrics. First, academic merit, which is the expected skill of admitted students. Second, the diversity level, which is the fraction of disadvantaged students in the admitted class. And finally, the individual fairness gap, which is the difference in admissions probability between two students of the same true skill level Q, but different groups. So given the theoretical framework I have just described, here are some of our main results. To start with some simple intuition, let's look more closely at the estimation process of the school. For every applicant, the school observes their group, A or B, and a subset S of their features. So the subset may or may not include test scores. Then the school uses this information for its individual student to compute their perceived skill estimate, which depends on the specific values of features and the other parameters of the model. At an aggregate level per group, and by repeating this process for all applicants, the school in the end obtains a perceived skill level distribution for every group G. So to optimize for the academic merit of the admitted class as the school wants, the school admits the applicants with the highest perceived skill estimate from each group. This leads to the following key observation in our model. Even though we start from identical true skill distributions for both groups, so both groups are born equally skilled, and the school is Bayesian optimal, our assumption on the precision's difference between groups A and B leads to a higher variance in the aggregate perceived skill level distribution for group B. In other words, the higher uncertainty in the features of disadvantaged students in Group B leads to more conservative estimates for their skill at an aggregate level, and as a result, to a greater concentration around the mean compared to Group A. This can be easily concluded from the resulting variance in the perceived skill level distribution of Group D that you see in the formula. Since the sum of precision across features is higher for Group A than Group B, the resulting variance in Group A is higher than that of Group B. This in turn implies that the greater mass of Group A students is considered to be high-skilled. So when a selective school with capacity C smaller than 1/2 sets their admission threshold in order to admit the students with the highest perceived skill level, more privileged students will be perceived as high-skilled and as a result will be admitted to the school. In other words, as it already becomes clear in the picture I have on the slide, privileged students are admitted at a greater rate than disadvantaged students, leading to the representation of disadvantaged students at the school. Our first theorem formalizes this intuition for our baseline policy. The baseline policy is test-based and without affirmative action, and assumes that no barriers to testing exist. So under no barriers to testing and under such a policy, disadvantaged students are underrepresented, and the individual fairness gap is positive for high-skilled students in Group B, meaning that very high-skilled disadvantaged students have a lower admission probability compared to privileged students in Group A. In terms of academic merit, we see that not only Group B students are admitted at a lower rate than Group A students, but the targeting of high-skilled students from Group B is worse. On the next slide, we see that when we consider the equivalent of this policy I just described, but now without test scores, the diversity level might decrease. The individual fairness gap increases for high-skilled students, and the academic merit decreases for both groups. So one might naturally ask at this point whether affirmative action could help. And both in theory and simulations, as you see on this slide, we study the effect of affirmative action with and without tests. So the results we get are kind of mixed. On the left graph, you can see that the test-based policy without affirmative action achieves strictly higher academic merit than a test-free policy without affirmative action. However, depending on the diversity level of our policy, the effect of affirmative action might reverse. On the right graph, we examine the effect of affirmative action on the individual fairness gap. We see that the test-free policy with affirmative action achieves the lowest gap for high-skilled students. So it helps in terms of individual fairness. Finally, on this slide, we study the effect of barriers. The complete study of our results can be found in our paper, but here are our main takeaways. So using affirmative action with a target diversity level tau, dropping test scores increases the academic merit of Group G, if and only if Group G faces sufficient barriers. So, in other words, if and only if this parameter gamma G, which is the fraction of students in Group G that can take the test, is below a threshold gamma hat G that we fully characterize in the paper. A similar result holds for a policy without affirmative action. However, the condition here is more complicated since it depends on both gamma A and gamma B. In terms of diversity, in this scenario, we find that diversity may decrease under certain conditions. Finally, we move to the last part of the talk, which is an application using data from Texas Higher Education Opportunity Project, and specifically from UT Austin in the period from 1992 to 1997. We consider our applicant population as those who in reality enroll to the university, UT Austin, so that we can observe their transcript data and simulate the setting where applicants need to be selected for, let's say, an honors program, fellowship, or college transfer. So for each individual, we use their final GPA as their true skill, and then class rank, major, college, and test scores are as additional features. We use the high school's economic privilege index to define the privileged and disadvantaged groups of students. And based on all those data, we train two models using OLS and sample an equal number of applicants from each group. For our simulations, we assume that 40% of the disadvantaged group do not have access to the test. In our first simulation, we find that dropping test scores might decrease diversity because high school rank is very informative for the disadvantaged group compared to test scores. However, in our second simulation, we use an additional feature, which is the first semester GPA. We see that using an additional feature that is very informative for both groups has the opposite effect. When dropping test scores, diversity now increases, and academic merit, as measured by the average GPA for the remainder of the studies of the students in our experiment, is almost not affected. More details about the setup and assumptions can be found in the paper. To conclude, I would like to reiterate the main message of our paper. Our Bayesian framework studies the effect of testing requirement on academic merit and diversity in college admissions. We saw that the implication of standardized testing depend on two competing effects: how the presence of testing barriers affects the applicant pool, and whether test scores improve applicant skill estimates. Specifically, we find that first, dropping test scores has an ambiguous impact on disparities, depending on the feature variances in both groups and access barriers to testing. Second, given substantial barriers to testing, dropping test scores improves both academic merit and diversity by increasing the applicant pool size. More broadly, we believe that our multi-feature take on the seminal model by Phelps naturally fits the study of several fair machine learning questions and the design of input features to machine learning tasks, and could serve as a useful conceptual framework to explore such questions. Thank you for your attention.